Yo, what up? Welcome to another episode of the Oakland Warriors podcast. I'm Patrick, flying solo. So here we are at 20 games. If you listen to this podcast, I've said let's check in with this Warriors team after 20 games, not because it means a huge amount, not like that it's definitive, but when the Warriors were going through their 0-5 losing streak and we were seeing those growing pains, I was like, let's see the vets get their legs a little bit. Let's see the bench and some of the young guys get more acclimated to bigger roles. And let's see what the coaching staff can come up with to kind of reverse some of the early season bad trends. And here we are. The Warriors are finally back at 500. Let's appreciate that for a second. They're 10-10. And as I've gotten used to doing, let's just check where they are in the standings. They are still in 11th place. That very tight 10-11 competition with the Minnesota Timberwolves that they'll be seeing on Sunday. They're half a game behind both them and the Mavericks for the 9-10 spots. And they are 3 games out of first place. I'm just doing this for fun because, of course, it's not that serious right now. But, you know, we are here at 10-10, 20 games in, and I personally feel better. This team is not fully formed, right? They are not ready for the playoffs. They are not ready to all of a sudden dominate like they did in stretches early last season. I mean, a year ago, they were 18-2, 10-10. So, you know, let's keep everything in perspective, though. If you're just kind of not a close fan and you just jump in right now and you're like, oh, wow, the Warriors are 10-10. They're not very good. But, you know, we saw how rough it was early on. And now they're starting to figure out some things, right? Like we've talked about the rotations and how putting Draymond in the second unit has really, really made a huge difference. And that has actually been a huge key because it brings defense, of course, to that second unit. And it also brings, I mean, it takes more pressure off of Poole. I've talked about how having Dante DiVincenzo back earlier from his hamstring injury would take some pressure off of Poole. But not only that, you get Draymond out there as a decision maker, a leader, a ball handler, an on-ball guy, a passer, whatever. And it allows Poole to do a little bit more off ball, and he doesn't have to create as much. And hopefully he even more so stops dancing out there and just makes those straight line drives. And, you know, it's funny because when Poole was going through his rough 2020, 2021 season, the whole thing was like, make a quick decision with the ball, you know, in half a second, you know, either pass it, shoot it, dribble, or do something. And right now it seems like he catches the ball and he sits, he sizes up, and that's fair. He's earned that right to kind of execute his style, his game a little bit. But I think sometimes that takes a little too long and it allows defenses to get set. It allows them to mentally get like ready for some of the things that they've seen Jordan Poole do on the scouting report. So, you know, again, something that he needs to kind of just keep working on. And it's been better, but just something to highlight as they go. So the Warriors, they beat the Jazz 129-118. So they're 9-1 at home and 1-9 on the road. If you want to just say, hey, flush those 5 games from that really, really weird early season road trip, you can, but it's still there. And again, the Warriors aren't fully formed. They're not the world beaters that they were at the beginning of last season. And who knows if they will get there, right? But when you follow the team closely, it's all about seeing those trends and seeing some progress. It's not about like, oh, all of a sudden we're back, right? They need to still tighten up and hone in on their defense. And they need to prove that they can take that on the road, right? There's a couple things on the road, right? Like defense wins on the road, but then also benches play worse on the road. And obviously we've seen that. right? But these new rotations, like that's something, that's the test, right? To see if that travels and if it works out. I'm hoping, and I think it will. There's some challenges coming up the next, 5 games or so, but I'm eager to see how they perform. Earlier in the season, when they seemed so lifeless, it was like, well, what team is going to show up? But now they're looking a lot more solid. Again, Klay Thompson is looking more like Klay Thompson. This string of now 4 games where he hasn't forced it, where he's come up in the clutch, where he's just been himself on the offensive end. That's important, right? He was 7 for 16, 6 for 12 from three, hit some big threes in the second half, 6 boards, very un-Klay like, which is very welcome, and 1 assist, 20 points. So that's a classic Klay Thompson game, right? If you recall, Klay Thompson, his averages a lot of times were just around 20 points, 21 points, 19 points, something like that. He was never somebody going off for 25. So this is solid, especially when you get 33 from Steph, 19 from Poole, 20 from Wiggins, 13 from Draymond, and even 10 from Kevon Looney. So the Utah Jazz, obviously they've had this hot start this season. I've said that the Warriors and the Jazz, it's pretty much like they traded places. Like the Warriors are supposed to be the favorites in a lot of people's minds, at least top 2 or 3 in the West, and the Jazz were competing for Victor Wembanyama, and then they kind of switched places, and now that's evening out a little bit, right? The Jazz, as admirable as their start has been, they just aren't talented enough. They are not as bad. They won't be as bad as people expected unless they decide to tank. But I think this was a game where it was like, if the Warriors lose, then that would be a real downer because they need to build up in the right direction. This was a perfect game to do that. On the schedule next, so the next 5 games, at Minnesota on Sunday, at Dallas on Tuesday. So they get a few days off, and they're at home against Chicago on Friday, a back-to-back against Houston on Saturday, the 3rd of December, and then Indiana at home on that Monday. So, you hear me talk about like these 5-game stretches, and I say, oh, it'd be nice to go 4-1. And, with this team, that they could. I don't know if they'll ever rack off some long winning streaks this year, but in this scenario, Dallas is a challenge, Minnesota's a challenge, Chicago's a challenge. But those last 3 games, Chicago, Houston, Indiana at home, I mean, they're NBA players and everything, but in my opinion, like those are 3 games they should get. So at the very minimum, 3-2, hopefully a little bit better than that. The Minnesota game will be really, really interesting because I'm curious to see how they are. That's a team that we all expected to be better than they have been, and maybe they're turning the corner too. But they've definitely had some growing pains of their own with Rudy Gobert. They're a team that doesn't have much leadership. And, Pat Beverly was the one guy who kind of fired up that team, like legitimately, really. Karl Anthony Towns does it. He tries, but it just seems, to be honest, seems a little like fraudulent. It doesn't feel real. It seems like a little artificial, but that's just me from the outside. So these next 2 games, Minnesota and Dallas, if they take both those, I mean, we're looking good, right? We're feeling good, more importantly. If they split them, not bad. If they lose both, then all of a sudden you're back kind of in back in the drawing board, right? Because what would be the issues if they couldn't take both those? Would it be their defense? Would it be their bench failing them? I mean, it's going to be either one of those because unless something crazy happens, their offense, especially their first unit, has been playing really well all season. And if they lose those games, it's going to be because the defense fails them or this new second unit kind of falls apart a little bit. But the second unit doesn't have to be world beaters. They just have to hold leads that Steph and the starters gift them. And the whole point is having Draymond to stabilize that. And it's, knock on wood, worked thus far. Another thing I've talked about up until this 20-game mark is those 7, 8, 9 bench spots, right? Like we know the top five, and then Poole is the sixth man. And even though Poole's been inconsistent, you know what he can bring, you know who he can be in the playoffs. So replacing guys like, the 7, 8, 9 from last season, Gary Payton II, Nemanja Bjelica, Otto Porter Jr., who can fill those roles. And right now, it's looking like they're filling those roles with four dudes: JaMychal Green, Dante DiVincenzo, Jonathan Kuminga, and Anthony Lamb. So those are the dudes that they're going with. And, it's not bad. It's not bad so far. Those guys look more comfortable overall. And JaMychal Green feels like the Warriors have figured out how to use him, what lineups work for him. And Dante DiVincenzo also kind of getting his legs under him, looking more comfortable. And Jonathan Kuminga, obviously all the talent in the world. But again, if you kind of toss that Pelicans game where he just jacked up shots and the whole team looked really, really bad, in this role, in limited minutes, he is doing what he needs to do. I talked about that in the Thanksgiving episode. And when he just does the simple things and doesn't try to do too much. I mean, he didn't take a shot. He had 3 boards in 13 minutes, +2. He plays tough defense, and that's what you need from him. You need the on-ball guy, right? Like we talked about early in the season, preseason, about how losing Gary Payton II, they'll have to do it. They'll have to replace what he did on ball by committee with guys like Andrew Wiggins, Klay Thompson, Moses Moody, Jonathan Kuminga, Andre Iguodala, Dante DiVincenzo. And none of those dudes have really, really proven to be able to do it. And Kuminga is one guy who can do it because he's young, he's athletic, he's tall, he's got a pretty wide wingspan, and he's up for the challenge. So I think Kuminga in those minutes, just being that, as I always say, dynamic, athletic dude, that threat to do a lot of things that teams have to look out for on the fringes, when they're guarding like Steph or Jordan Poole or Klay or Wiggins or focusing on those dudes, they have to look over their shoulder for a guy like Jonathan Kuminga to pop out of nowhere and dunk on their heads or cut to the basket, So it feels like that 7, 8, 9 is starting to solidify a little bit. It's not going to be the same. I would love for, as solid as Anthony Lamb can be, I would love for, honestly, Moses Moody to get past him. I know Moody plays a little bit smaller than Lamb, but you should be able to steal minutes from that dude down the road. And then, of course, James Wiseman. When you watch this team out there and the rotation off the bench is after Poole, it's DiVincenzo, Green, Kuminga, and Lamb. In my ideal world, in the second half of the season or somewhere, maybe even sooner before the calendar year ends, I would love to see Wiseman get a shot at replacing Lamb, because then if your bench all of a sudden, just, humor me for a second, if your bench is Poole, Green, Kuminga, DiVincenzo, and Wiseman, and those guys start coalescing more and more, and Kerr starts trusting them, if Wiseman can be the best version of himself right now, not the version that we all see in a couple years, if he can be the best version of himself right now, then, that lineup, that bench offers you a lot of what we had hoped earlier in the season. But again, don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, just thinking that this team is looking like it's going in the right direction. The NBA season is heating up, and there are still so many unknowns. Like, will James Wiseman actually be on this Warriors team by the end of the season? I hope so. When I'm looking to get in on the action, I bet with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. New customers can bet just $5 pregame moneyline on any NBA team to win their game and get $150 in free bets if they do. Check this out. Right now, everyone can earn up to a 100% boost with DraftKings stepped-up same-game parlays. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, place a same-game parlay, and combine multiple bets like which team will win, total rebounds, and more. The more legs you add, the bigger the boost, the bigger your shot to win big. The app is super easy to use. Just pop it open, do what you got to do, and you're good to go. Download the app now, sign up with code TBPN, place a $5 pregame moneyline bet on any NBA team to win their game, and get $150 in free bets if they do. That's code TBPN only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Minimum age and eligibility restrictions apply. See show notes for details. Another thing that is interesting to point out is when Draymond had that talk with Klay Thompson after that Suns game, when Klay had just a really, really just bad game, hunting shots and everything like that. He's had a hell of a week, right? It's just all of a sudden gone from, Klay is chasing ghosts to, all right, Klay's back to kind of who he was or who he was at the end of last season, at the end of the finals. It's interesting to think about that because, right, we started the season with Draymond punching Jordan Poole and that whole controversy, and that doesn't get talked about much anymore. But you got to think that maybe that had some effect on Draymond's ability to speak up and his leadership. He'll always talk, but who knows, right? Because like everybody's talking about him having to have earned their trust back in the locker room. So, it could be that one of those things that it got so bad after that second Suns loss last week that Draymond had to speak up. And I bring that up because maybe if that whole punching Jordan Poole didn't happen, maybe Draymond speaks up earlier. Maybe he lights a fire and calls out what's wrong earlier in the season instead of just kind of he has to bite his tongue a little bit because he's not in a very solid leadership spot at that point. Maybe he does it during the 0-5 road trip. Maybe he calls them out after losing to Charlotte, after losing to Detroit or Orlando. But obviously things got bad enough finally, and he had more time and distance away from the preseason that it was time for him to do it now. This is all just hypothetical, theoretical. And if that's the case, maybe things behind the scenes are getting to some kind of semblance of normalcy. Won't claim to have any inside knowledge or credentials or anything like that. But, just from studying this team game to game, between games, observing and just watching them over the past few seasons, right? Seeing how these trends go. And you can just say, hey, they're at 500. They're not good. They're not bad. But you look at the trends, and that's what I was hoping for when I would say, let's see how they are in 20 games. If they look hopeless and if it looks like futile, then it is what it is. But obviously, it's not at that point anymore right now. Things can change. They could change for the worse. They can go back to how they were, but they can also change for the better. And it's clear that that's where it's going because, like I said, the starting unit has been really, really good all season long, and the bench is starting to figure it out. And at 10-10, as they start getting over 500 more and more, you'll get more opportunity to honestly like rest some of the vets as the season wears on them because Steph has been carrying such a massive load, and Draymond as well, and etc. But not just that, but then you'll also be able to tinker a little bit more with Moses Moody and eventually James Wiseman, who is still in the G League. And ideal scenario is by mid-season at some point, it starts looking like the team that we maybe thought we were going to have at the beginning of the season, right? The idea that, the narrative could be that the preseason, the whole Jordan Poole punching thing, and the fact that the young guys weren't as ready as we'd all expected or hoped, and the fact that the vets needed some time, especially Klay. And, Jordan Poole still isn't fully where we hope he'll be. So, it could just be one of those things that they were thrown off by the events of the preseason and that nobody was fully ready to go at this season. I don't know. That could change. It's just an idea. It's just a thought. It's just how I kind of see things maybe playing out as the season goes. But again, a long way to go. If they go 0-2 against Dallas and Minnesota in the next few days, then that'll be a shame. But ride the trends, and things are trending upwards. So we'll we'll hang our hats on that for now, and I'll check you out the next one. All right. Well, that is another episode of the Oakland Warriors podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Patrick E. Pino or at Oakland Warriors. Check out our YouTube channel where you can watch this episode, youtube.com/Oakland Warriors. Check us out at oaklandwarriors.com, and be sure to tell your fellow Warrior fan friends to tune in and listen. The Oakland Warriors podcast is produced by National Film Society and is a part of the Basketball Podcast Network. And if you're so inclined, please do leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to leave us a nice review saying good stuff about the show on Apple Podcasts, that would be hugely, hugely appreciated, and it would be very, very helpful. Thanks. That's it. Music in this episode provided by Paper Sun. Special thanks to Paul Amardo for production support. See you next time, and go Dubs.